Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I'm making a video response, actually I should say it's a book review of the book entitled The Jung Cult, Origins of a Charismatic Movement by Richard Noll. As many of you know who have watched my videos on psychology, I am a huge fan of the psychology of Carl Gustav Jung and his analytical psychology or Jungian psychology. And I've discussed Jung on several occasions along with Freud. And this book is a book that's actually a criticism of Jung. And I am very open when it comes to criticism. I enjoy reading books on criticism and seeing what sort of argumentation an author will provide. I've done some research on Richard Noll and people's reactions to his book. And he's written two books, this and a book called The Aryan Christ, which I will be reading, and I might do a video about that book as well. But essentially, this man thinks that Jung is, in a nutshell, is full of crap, that his theories are preposterous, and that he essentially abandoned scientific clinical psychology to create a cult surrounded around himself that would act as a religion to replace the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's his views in a nutshell, and many people have refuted Richard Noll. The two scholars off the top of my head are the two leading scholars on Jungian psychology. Sona Shamdasani, who is the editor of the Red Book, which I will be doing a video on the Red Book. This is the Red Book by Carl Jung. He's also a historian of psychology, and he has refuted Noll on a number of occasions with about 3 books, as well as subsequent articles. Anthony Stevens, who is a Jungian psychologist and also an author on post-Jungian theory, has done a book called On Jung, and at the very back of the book he has a complete refutation to many of Richard Noll's points. There's also an article that I'll be putting in the description section called Cult and Controversy, which is by, this person's not even a therapist, this person is just a student of psychology, I believe is a professor, actually, of psychology, who's done an online article where he subsequently refutes many of Noll's arguments, his major arguments that are found in both this book and in the other book. So, the thing is that I want to be very clear. I read this book with an open mind. I respect Jung's views. I agree with many of the things that he says in his psychological theories. I have not read everything by Jung yet, but I am making my way, as many of you know, through the works of Freud and Jung, and I'm trying to read them in the order in which they were written. But I'm very open to criticism, and so I read this thinking, well, hey, maybe Jung did want to start a religion that revolved around himself. And so before I had read the criticisms made by others about Noll, I wanted to see if anything would come up while I was reading this that would make me think, based on my own readings of Jung and Jung's works, whether my crap detector would go off and I realized this guy is just way off the mark. What I found is that some of my own personal views do mirror, coincidentally enough, other scholars that have, scholars who have also criticized Noll and have read Noll's works and are very familiar with Jung's works. And so there are just some points that I'd like to make, and I wrote down some points while I was reading the book. And these are my own points that were that I feel that are original to myself, and I have not yet found in any other criticism of Richard Noll. First off, before I get to the criticism, there is one thing I have to say about Richard Noll's book that's actually very good. I have to admit that the first part of the book, where he talks about the Central Europe, German, Swiss, French society and culture during the late 1800s, early 1900s, he discusses the literary, the spiritual, the religious, the philosophical environment in which Jung was born and raised in. And so that is very fascinating. And I have to admit that that is something that I was not fully aware of, even though I have read a couple biographies of Jung, and I still have some others to read. But he does a great job of talking about the historical context in which Jung was influenced, and talks about Nietzsche and a lot of these other things. But I'm going to get to, this is some of my criticisms here. While that is good, that's the only good thing I can say about the book. The rest of the book is, well, anyway. The first thing is that I just did a video called a Dangerous Method, which was my response to the movie trailer to the movie of the same name, and that's based off of a book by a scholar named Kerr, who apparently, I guess, was a teacher of Noll. Or at least they know each other professionally, but he gives credit to Kerr. And Kerr wrote the book about the Jung, Freud, Sabina Spellrein triangle relationship. And I've already talked about that in that video, so if you're interested in my thoughts about that topic, go ahead and watch that. But I want to point out that in this book, Richard Noll, the author of this book here, does a great job of implying sexual eroticism where there is no evidence. And Kerr himself never implies anything that he doesn't have any evidence for, which is the difference between Kerr and Noll. Noll, throughout the whole book, implies things that he has no evidence for, or tries to fill in the gaps where he has no evidence, and that's something that he does with this topic. He talks about the colleague and friend of Jung named Otto Gross, who was... Gross was an interesting guy. He had a lot of very anarchist, very, very sexual liberation views. And they had, Gross was a patient of Jung's, and they analyzed each other during Gross's stay at the Bugazlia Mental Institute where Jung was working. This is before Jung had his own private practice. And he says that Gross influenced Jung. And one thing I want to point out is that throughout the book, Noll will talk about literary movements, spiritual movements, things that Jung might have read, and I want to be very clear that he uses a lot of the time in the book, might have, or we can assume, which to me is not evidence, as far as if you're talking about facts about someone's actual influences. I find that throughout the whole book, Noll commits the fallacy of guilt by association. It's like, okay, so Jung had a conversation with Gross, and suddenly Jung's a hedonist. I mean, the thing is that, as I admitted, Jung did believe in polygamy. In other words, he believed that a man could have a active, healthy relationship with more than one spouse. No one denies this, but apparently he says that Gross had a lot of this hedonistic rubbing off on Jung, which I just don't see it, especially since Jung does not go about doing the same acts that Gross does throughout his life. So if Gross truly had a magnificent influence on Jung, I just don't see it. At one point he talks about in the book is that Freud represented the Darwin primordial horde based on patriarchy. In other words, that Freud in his book Totem and Taboo, which I'll probably discuss in a future video in some detail, mentions that in his belief, he has a belief that the Oedipus complex, the nuclear family, is something that is represented by historical, mental, hereditary lineage that goes all the way back to pre-man. And he bases this off of Darwin. This is Freud now. And he says that there's a battle of... It's basically that theory versus Jung and some of the German scholars who believe that there was an evolution of not only sexuality, but an evolution of societal roles with genders. That first you had a society of polygamy slash polyandry, which moved into matriarchy, which is represented by the goddess worships that we can see evidence for in archaeology, and then finally into patriarchy. And this is something that Joseph Campbell talks about. This is something that Marcea Lottie talks about. And Noll seems to really think that Jung... he seems to imply that this is a ridiculous notion. The latter, Jung's view, that there was this evolution of sexuality and societal gender roles and things like this. And the thing is, if Noll really believes that, he thinks that Freud and Darwin are actually correct. There are two books that are textbooks of mine. They're actual books, but we use them as textbooks in two sexuality classes that I'm taking at my university. One is called let's see here. I think it's called the Evolution's Rainbow by Ruff Garden. The other one is Sex at Dawn. And I forget the author's name of that one, but both of these are very modern looks at human sexuality and sexuality variations, and they really explained how Darwin was actually wrong about human sexuality in his initial writings, and that Darwin would flip-flop in his views on gender roles and sexuality. And so if Darwin influenced Freud, as Noll represents and as Freud himself admits at certain points in his writings, then we find that Freud and Darwin are wrong. And that Jung, maybe not in a literal sense, but Jung and many of the theories that he associated with, according to Noll, are actually correct. So Noll is actually wrong. He then says that cryptomnesia, which is this psychological concept where you read something, you hear something, you learn something, and you forget that you ever heard or learned that concept later on, you think it's original thought of your own. So you could be like, you could have thought to yourself, oh, that's an amazing plot, or maybe you're an author, you're like, oh yes, I have this idea, and you realize that you heard that somewhere, but you forgot that you heard it, and then you think that it's your own original idea. He believes that the collective unconscious is that there is no collective unconscious, that everything that every culture learned their religious symbols, their religious doctrines from somebody else. They subsequently forgot that they had learned that from another culture and then presented it as original. If one were to look at the theory of the collective unconscious, and the thing is that Jung actually did believe in cryptomnesia, but the difference between cryptomnesia and collective unconscious is that cryptomnesia is a conscious act. This is something that happens when you are conscious. It is an idea that you thought of something while you were awake, and then you realize it was not original thought. The collective unconscious is unconscious. It has to do with dreams. It has to do with the idea that a dream appears. Now, sure, someone could be very, very well-read in, let's say, fairy tales, and they have a dream that's, say, Little Red Riding Hood, and the dream, occurs in that fashion. Now, the thing is that there are multiple things to uphold the collective unconscious. I'll talk about the collective unconscious in future videos, but for now, there are two things to consider. One, what if it's a culture that doesn't have such stories, and yet they have dreams of those stories? So for example, let's say there's no Little Red Riding Hood story that's in Chinese culture, just hypothetically. And then they talk to somebody and they go, oh, well, there's a story that occurs over in Europe, and the Chinese have no Little Red Riding Hood. That would be evidence, someone could argue, of the collective unconscious. Another reason why there's evidence of a collective unconscious is that, according to psychodynamic or depth psychology, Freudian and Jungian and etc., is that according to Freud, for example, your unconscious content, the content of your unconscious is supposed to be completely personal. In other words, there's not supposed to be impersonal concepts floating around in there. And yet what we find, and this is what we find with ourselves, and I think anybody who's had a dream can admit this, and Jung chronicled this, is that you have dreams that are totally impersonal, that have nothing to do with yourself. And so, and the concepts in there are mythic, or may have aspects that are totally beyond yourself. That, again, someone could argue is evidence for the collective unconscious. So I think it's very, very unjustifiable to kick the collective unconscious out of the conversation of psychology by just replacing it with cryptomnesia, which is meant to be a conscious experience and not an unconscious one. He then goes on to say that Jung wanted to, attack Christianity, that his goal was to start a new religion. And again, throughout the whole book, I was waiting for an explicit statement where Jung says, yes, I'm a prophet, and, I think Christianity's bullcrap, and I'm going to replace it with Jungian psychology. I just didn't see that anywhere. Jung certainly was not a huge fan of the way organized religions had developed during his time. He felt that a more personal, individualized religion was needed, or religious experience, and that's why he looked at the Hindu traditions, the Taoist traditions, the Buddhist traditions. He looked at the mystics of all religions, including Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions, and he found that they were all saying the same thing, that people could have this direct experience with God. So he didn't really feel, and the thing is that Noll never talks about this in the book, the subsequent books of Jung's that talk about this, the fact that Jung was simply bringing forth into the 20th century a concept that had been in philosophy and religion and psychology since the ancient period. So he wasn't saying he was a prophet. He wasn't saying that he was original. He was just talking about this in a modern setting. And I think if one were to read Jung's Red Book it would totally refute Noll's statements in his books, which indeed other people have mentioned. Thank you for watching. Peace be with you all.